What?
Just a few words. Buenas tardes. Nuestro invitado de hoy del coloquio, Nico Frijda, vino a Chile por primera vez a propósito de un congreso que fue invitado a presentar. Y no sé si lo conocían de antes o no, pero cualquiera que se introduzca en la literatura de investigación en emociones va a salir su nombre desde hace muchos años. Tiene contribuciones importantes desde los años 80 hasta el día de hoy. Es alguien que ha contribuido de varias maneras a la disciplina. Me gustaría simplemente destacar un aspecto de hoy porque tiene que ver con su presentación. Y es que, como en algunos ámbitos de la psicología ocurre, también en la psicología de las emociones, domina una investigación empírica que no siempre está bien acompañada de teoría. Y él a lo largo de su carrera ha sido muy insistente en que la producción de datos y en general la investigación debe estar acompañada de un desarrollo teórico que justamente él mismo ha contribuido también a generar, y lo que va a presentar hoy es algo que él ha preparado especialmente para su visita a Chile, que es yo diría una explicación de cuáles son las bases naturales de la emoción y cuál es la naturaleza de esa emoción, o de lo que llamamos emociones, que son muchas cosas. Y como van a ver, mucho tiene que ver con cómo como vivientes, como organismos vivos, estamos preparados para la acción y la interacción. Ese es el ámbito en el que él sitúa a las emociones. Él va a exponer en inglés, después las preguntas las pueden hacer en castellano o en inglés, da lo mismo, seguramente de todas maneras vamos a tener que repetírselas cerca de su oído, porque él tiene una audición muy baja, así que no se extrañen si no les entiende de inmediato, pero él va a hacer todo su esfuerzo, es muy entusiasta. Bueno, y estamos felicísimos de tenerlo de visita. Además entiende un poco de castellano. Sí. That's it. I was just presenting you. The idea is to give a 1 hour talk,
Yes.
and then have like 20 minutes
Try not to be
discussion.
longer than that.
No, sure. Is that okay? Is it works?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit shorter since we're starting late. Maybe about 50 minutes.
Can you understand me like?
No.
Yes?
Maybe we don't need this. Yeah.
Fine.
That's all right.
Happy about that.
So yeah, she's saying that maybe not an hour, a bit less. Could it be 45 minutes?
I tried to.
I'll make you.
I'll try.
Right.
I'm very happy to be invited here, not only for the conference, but invited for the young people in this class, because I suppose you being young, you probably are critical for everything that we teachers say, so I hope I can do my best. And the issue of emotion, of course, is an interesting one. I mean, I think we all feel that our lives turn around emotions and they give substance to our lives. You can still understand me, right? But the problem is that the concept of emotion is an obscure concept. It's very strange, and that is why development of theory and the study of emotion has been rather slow, because so far nobody has been capable of giving a definition of what emotions are. Yes? It was not very long ago that the special issue was devoted to one of the main journals in the field of emotion, in which a number of people tried to define emotion, something like 6 or 7 contributions to that journal, and all those contributions did not in any way agree to what emotions were. Evidently, it is impossible to give a coherent definition of emotion. That's strange, but that's how it is. And that is how it is because, in fact, it has been argued, and I think it is very rightly argued, that what we call emotions is not one coherent and single thing. If you look at it philosophically, the word emotion is not the name for a basic process or a basic set of processes. As it is also impossible to say, well, you have the brain, and there is the center for emotions. That is not how it is. In fact, the word emotion was introduced into psychology at the time by Descartes, the philosopher, who used it 300 years ago, or how much it was, whereas the word emotion at that time just only meant, in Old French, uproar, riot, disorder. And to define what emotions are on the basis of the meaning of the word emotion turned out to be impossible because it covers so many different things. In fact, I think the word emotion was used and introduced by, before that time in Western languages, the word passion was used, yes, and the Greek pathema. And the word was used because in looking at other people and in looking at oneself, there are in fact a number of things that strike in behavior. Strike in the behavior of ourselves, strike in the behavior of our fellow men and women that we meet. The word emotion fits just the fact that there are a large number of aspects of behavior. How do I operate that machine? This?
I don't know, maybe this one? Is it? No. Maybe, I think just pressing that one.
Right.
If you want.
No, that's fine.
You do it?
No,
No, it's fine.
one further. You had it here? Yeah,
No,
this one.
that's fine.
This one. No, that one.
Where do I get?
Yes.
There, this one. Yeah, okay. In looking at ourselves and in looking at other people, there are a number of aspects of behavior and other aspects that strike the eye, that turn out to be somewhat different as our calm and considerate way of saying and doing things. There are, in fact, in the behavior of people, a number of interesting aspects that strike the eye. The first of which is that sometimes in what people do, say, and so on, there are reactions that appear to engage the entire person. An emotion is not just the manifestation of one single power or capacity, but they appear to engage the entire person. People do things, they perceive things, they attend to what they perceive, they respond to what they perceive. They also tremble and look pale, even if it's not cold, and all this may be shown at one and the same time. Second, one of the major and interesting aspects in human behavior and human feeling and animal behavior and animal feeling is that animals and humans show actions that establish or modify their relationships to other people or to events in the world. The major thing that strikes the eye and that makes what other people do or what we ourselves do or feel to do comes from the fact that we constantly respond to other people and to events by modifying how we relate to things. Sometimes we close off, and sometimes we approach, and so on and so forth. Third, one of the interesting aspects of behavior that makes us use the word emotion is that quite often an individual's reaction or action may appear to overcome them. It takes control of us. Sometimes we say, well, what I cannot help it, but I feel I have to do it, or it just happens. Or we do things that we know we should not do. Sometimes, not infrequently, we say things that at the same time that we say them, we know that we are wrong in saying them, and we're stupid in saying them. Like, for instance, somebody whom you have to make in a friendly way, yes? You might say that I dislike you, which is very stupid of saying because nobody ever liked it. So one of the interesting things that makes us use the word emotion, that people do things in spite of the fact that they know that it would have been better if they had not done it. Fourth, what a person does is sometimes going on with more force and faster than is practically needed, and it interferes what one was planning to do. Sometimes one's reactions go on for a longer time than you would expect, such as somebody is nasty to you, you start hitting him or her, that might continue while that person already is for a long time silent or even on the floor, and you may still go on and hit. It has been observed, for instance, in marital quarrels. Yes, marital quarrels quite often are violent. People stab each other, and they may go on making many more stabs than would be necessary to keep your way. Yes, so these again are all one of the aspects that makes us use the word of emotion. And of course, one of the major things that makes us use the word of emotion, or something like anger or fear or whatever, is because we feel to be invaded by feelings. Feel anger, whatever that may mean, whatever the word may mean, when we feel sort of things, all sorts of things, and we act out of feeling impulses that, as I said, quite often are very difficult to not do. Yes? And sometimes the interesting thing is we want to do things, and from the inside it becomes for us impossible to do. I remember when I was a young boy and there was a girl who interested me, I did not know what to say to her, which is not really a way to make an impression, but it shows that emotions may influence behavior in ways that do not correspond to what we would like to be. Now, I just mentioned that when you get a group of people, psychologists or whatever, together to talk about emotions, that it turns out to be impossible to find a definition. And that it is impossible to find a definition is because the word emotion, as I say, is not a word to designate a particular sort of process, but because there are many things that do not have anything in common. Everything that we call an emotion is not all having one or a few single signs, but it is what they call in philosophy a substance concept. The concept, emotion is a concept that designates quite a few rather discrete things that have very little relationship to one another, and that you can locate in a particular part of the brain, for instance. The word emotion is what they called in philosophy a substance concept, presuming a thing or one single process to be there, where it's very difficult to find out what the functions are. And the whole progress of science, of scientific approach to these phenomena, is to replace words like emotion, even to replace words like anger or fear, by the functions that might be engaged by the activities that are shown. In fact, the word of emotion is in a very strange, almost the same as the word soul. And the word soul, again, like emotion, it is impossible to locate the soul. We don't know even whether the soul is a real meaningful word. And still, we do all sorts of things, we are capable of doing all sorts of things that formerly were called parts of the soul. Yes? Aristotle, for instance, enumerated these parts of the soul like nutrition, like perception, like imagination, like desire, like self-initiated movement. And these are more or less independent of one another, except for the fact that they all disappear when you stop breathing or when your heart stops beating, and the soul is nowhere anymore. It evaporates in thin air, it disappears. And I think science does not believe that once that you die, the soul rings up into the heavens. I think that is not in accordance to how we imagine things to go. So trying to ponder what the word emotion might possibly mean, I think it is not useful to try to find out by analyzing the word emotion what it might possibly mean, and it is not the way I think we should try to approach to understand what these words then refer to. I think to treat the phenomena, the basis of the phenomena that we call emotion, it is better strategy to consider what being alive really entails. Yes? If we assume that the behaviors, the feelings that are part of what we call emotions, they are so general and so essential for life that it might be better just forget for a moment the whole notion of emotion and find out what it is that characterizes that a being is alive. And maybe in just wondering what it is to be alive and how to characterize a creature as being alive, that we might come across to something that indeed is relevant for explaining and understanding the phenomena at hand. Unfortunately, there have been philosophers, well, not only philosophers, there have been biologists who pondered what the characterizations are of creatures that we call alive. Yes. And in fact, we are here, I mean in Santiago, we are here in a very good place to ponder the whole notion of being alive because of the existence of two Chilean biologists who were very important and central in wondering what the very nature of being alive could be characterized. And these biologists were Francesco Varela and I think he was called Humberto Maturana, yes, who said, well, there are beings, not glasses, not chairs, but beings that we call alive, that manage to show what they called, Maturana and Varela said, they are autonomous. They can fence for themselves. They are, in the words of what this man said, they show autopoiesis. That is, there is an interrelated set of processes that form a network, so that when one element, one of the processes that are interrelated with another, manage to keep the other processes going, that turns back into the functioning of the processes at the next moment. And I think I have a picture of that depicts the structure of an autopoietic organism. You have a bounded system that generates a metabolic reaction network that produces molecular components, which molecular components take up energy and chemicals from the environment that continue the functioning of the metabolic network, and so on and so forth. And that is one that then allows the organism can have this aspect of autonomy because of two implications of the way that these different sub-processes are organized and influence each other. One is the feedback implied by circular causality. Yes, as you see, the process in a living organism is circular. It influences the next process or set of processes that influence the previous set of processes at a further stage. Circular causality is one of the interesting features of alive systems that then cannot be reduced to one of the single ones, but their circular relationship. And there's another extremely interesting aspect of alive systems, and that they show self-organization. Yes, they modify their own processes by their mutual influences. Self-organization sounds like a very strange concept, but it is not, because the easiest way to imagine self-organization is when you have a large number of aspects that function, are active together, and that influence each other. The whole system can do things that one single element of the system cannot possibly do. Yes, for instance, if you have water drops have no force whatsoever, until you have a large number of water drops that move in a certain direction, that influence each other, that make a tsunami, and that destroy dikes and lives and countries, thanks to the fact of self-organization. And the same is operating, let us say, in the connection, the interconnection of the different elements of the system. Now, apart from the autonomy that is being caused by the fact that there are these circular processes, one of the major outcomes of these circular processes is the fact that what we call alive systems are in possession of the possibility for making self-initiated movements. One of the major characteristics of what we call alive systems is that they move in a way that is not dependent on the movement of something else. Yes? For instance, the smallest alive system that you can imagine that exist are bacteria. Bacteria are extremely small elements, and the study of bacterial motion shows that how movement can emerge in these small living organisms. For instance, take the bacterium called Escherichia coli. Sorry for the name, but it is the bacterium that in million-fold lives and is active in our entrails, or how do you call that? Well, I don't know how it is called in Spanish, but here, down below, and they digest all food. They digest all food, and they do this because bacteria can move and can move about. And how can they move about? They have tails. And the bacteria have sort of tails that protrusions from the body of the bacteria itself that make these bacteria move around in their environment. And they can do this owing to the fact that the bacteria are built up, their organs or their elements are built up from complex proteins. Proteins that are elaborate, quite often very complicated, elaborate molecules that transform chemical energies into kinetic energy, that make the motor proteins walk alongside the tails of the of the bacteria, yes? And when these pictures indicate a little bit how the proteins walk along the flagellae, the tails of the bacterium, how they move in one direction, and by doing that make the tail bend due to the movement of these proteins. Yes? And why do these proteins move about? For one thing, because they can do so, they can take the place in connection with the element of the rest of the bacterium that moves about. They make these tails move, and the movement then evidently comes from inert, by itself inert elements being the complex proteins. And in a more interesting organism, little organism, all this is more fascinating and more telling, because not only do bacteria move about by their proteins moving their tail, there is of course one type of organism that everybody comes from, namely the male seed, a sperm cell. You have to speak. It's very fascinating if ever of you once had the occasion to look at sperm cells, male sperm cells by a microscope. They move about vividly and actively, and in the situation that they are searching for, in search for finding a female cell, namely an ovarian, thanks to the fact that by the movement of their tail they move about as long as they can until they might be able to penetrate one of those eggs. Now, why do I tell this story about bacteria? Bacteria are alive and at the same time extremely small, and the study of bacteria has shown how the nanostructure of these bacteria are capable. A molecule, of course, is just a stable structure of chemical elements, and the chemical elements in one molecule can take place and replace another one, and that is how their movement comes about. Self-initiated movements in alive organisms, but elements that are themselves not real. A molecule is not alive, it's only alive when it exchanges its parts in other ones. So, when the study of bacteria is sort of a key, not really a completely understood key, but a key to the emergence of life from anorganic, from non-alive substances. Yes? Salt consists of molecules, but very simple ones that have not the capacity of moving about and making something else transform itself, so that the bacterium can move around in its environment. The basic property of self-initiated motion is the most elementary process that is the beginning of the core of being alive, coming from what in itself is another life substance. The self-movement is such a very elementary process, that it is such an elementary process, is shown by the fact that newborn organisms endeavor to move. As butterfly larvae seek to escape from their pods, baby starts to move in the womb, newborn mammals try to stand within minutes after birth. I don't know whether you ever have seen a baby animal being born, a little horse, a little cat. It comes out of the mother, and within minutes it struggles to get on its feet, nobody telling it to do, but evidently the molecules in there possess an urge of doing what they are structured to do. Now, that is interesting. But what is more interesting is that not only can bacteria move and displace themselves from one place to another, bacteria under many circumstances show movement that has a particular direction. If you have one of those bacteria like those living in the entrails, yes, they not only move, but they move they do move in a particular direction when the environment gives reason for doing so. For instance, these bacteria at least move in the direction that where the fluids that they are swimming in the entrails or wherever it is, that they move in a direction where the glucose content of the solution they swim in is increasing in concentration. A bacterium of this sort swims in the direction that is good for the bacterium. It is richer in foodstuffs. Yes? And when they come into an environment where there is no different degree of concentration of, for instance, glucose, they do not swim in that direction, they swim in another direction, or they start moving randomly. And what this means is that even an animal as small and as elementary as a bacterium is capable or is so structured that it moves towards environments that are favorable to their further existence. Yes, a bacterium swims in the direction where it is finding its food, and it swims away from a concentration that is harmful to the animal, to the bacterium. It swims in a different direction. That is, even an organism as simple as a bacterium knows to make a difference between what is good for it and what is bad for it. That means that an animal as simple as a bacterium or as a human male sperm cell makes a difference in its behavior with respect to its environment, that you would say it moves in a direction that shows that it evaluates events. It evaluates events in terms of the autopoietic operation cycles by stimulating that which is good for the animal and avoiding the parts of the environment that are bad for the animals. How is that possible? How is it possible that such an elementary organisms can sense these differences in concentration and these elements that are might be good or bad for the whole subsequent sub-processes? It is because all these little animals, the bacteria, have a membrane. And the membrane contains a large number of elementary molecules again that are sensitive to a large number of signals from the environment, like for instance, as I mentioned, glucose. Yes. Generally, bacteria show what are called chemotaxis. Chemotaxis meaning moving towards or away from particular substances, because these substances impinge on little sense organs in the skin or the membrane around the bacterium. In other words, even a small thing like a bacterium has a large number of sense organs that dictate its further mode of behavior. The numerous substance-sensitive molecules on the cell membrane give off different signals within multiple step feedback interactions at the molecular level. Interestingly, when the The core, the bacterium has a number of those flagellae, these little kind of tails. Yes? They move in coordinated fashion when they are touching upon molecules on the outside membrane of the bacterium. But they start to move, the flagellae start to move in uncoordinated fashion, which means that they swim in another direction away from this concentration. Or they start to, the flagellae start to move in uncoordinated fashion, which means that they just move at random. And it is, what this means is that even at the most elementary level of a live organism, there is a first beginning of what in the later development of the combination of molecules of bacteria or elementary cells, what later on turns out to be the distinction between positive and negative affect. When, as a bacterium, you encounter substances that set the autopoietic processes going, yes, the bacterium engages to get more of this, long before anything like the feelings of pleasure or displeasure are emerging, but already at the first moments in the development of life, that there are processes that announce the difference in evaluation of what is good or what is bad for the animal. Now, the interesting thing is that they can do so because not only are bacteria capable of self-initiated movement, they evidently are also capable of perception, in a sense that they respond differentially to different elements in the environment. Yes, owing to, as I said, owing to the sensitive molecules on the membrane surrounding the bacterium. Of course, this is only at a very elementary level. In organisms, bacteria included, are open to their environments. They, in a sort of way, perceive. They are just not enclosed on the contrary, they are open to their environments. They are sensitive to many agents in that environment. And evolution, of course, enhances the information that can be taken up in the bacteria only by simple molecules, in multicellular organisms like more complicated animals, and of course like what we usually call animals. Their sensitive organs develop in the direction of being much more open to complicated structures of information, and the higher you get up into evolution, you find the much larger processing capabilities that can, for the one thing, process structured information like in visual perception. Yes, there are elementary bacteria that are sensitive to light and that move in the direction of light, the phototaxis, but later on, because of the collaboration of many sensitive molecules, they form what we have as sense organs, ears and eyes, and the possibilities of touch. That all are combinations in a long way of complexity from the beginnings of these processes, from the beginning in the elementary forms of life in the bacteria. The interesting thing is that in higher organisms, not only to the particular stimuli in the environment that set the animal in movement and that give rise to different processes. In human perception, or in the perception of higher animals, higher than bacteria, perception plays two different roles. It, for one thing, makes things do things. So like I mentioned, that the bacteria swims in a certain direction or swims away in a different direction. But in addition, in higher organisms, the information taken up from the environment includes the remains of previous experience in the environment. Very interesting, there is an important neuroscientist called Gerald Edelman, who expresses that he said, what we experience in the world, our conscious experience consists of perception of objects and the organisms and the information that was combined with the incoming information in the previous encounters and the previous life of the animal. What we experience, Edelman says, is a remembered presence. What we perceive, due to the combination of original and early information, plus what is recalled from previous encounters, provides the information. When we perceive the world, when we perceive things like in visual perception or tactile perception, what we experience is not only stimuli, but it's meaningful information. Meaningful information, meaning the implications of the particular information that comes of a particular moment. What the event that they are the animal is confronted with may do to or offer to the system. Hit it, approach it, inform it, provide food, threaten it. All these processes that provide meanings that in the psychology of emotion are usually referred to by the word appraisal. All these processes are automatic. We are not aware of the processes. We are only aware of what they might do to us and what they might make us. There is another aspect coming from the fact that any perception is an outflow from what you encounter and what previous information was associated to well is the meaning of the environment in our perception is what is being called the existence of affordances. When we perceive objects, we not only see their form, we see what we can do with them or what they make do with them. Yes? When you come across and perceive a cup, it immediately makes clear and also and it evokes the inclination, the possibility of the inclination of picking it up and pouring things to it. Yes? You never perceive a cup as just a geometrical structure, but only something that is engaged and involved in interaction with it. All this importantly augments the autonomy of the nervous system. It has the effect of intertwining the sensory and the motor into sensory motor couplings. Perception, in fact, is an active process. We only can perceive what we perceive because we adjust our eyes or hands or noses with the incoming information, elaborating what we thereby can find. Living systems and the environment to some extent from a higher level system. Not only is the information that we use, meanings that we encounter in perception enriched by previous experiences, it also because, of course, the higher animals, mostly humans, but also other animals, can construct their own information that they never encountered. Is imagination is one of the major aspects of the whole of perception that we can think of, and it comes to the mind, think of what things that can happen, that might happen. Human and also higher animals are capable of dealing with what is possible and not only what is actually present. One of the major aspects that perception also constitutes the meaning of perception is that things that we see and things that we smell and things that we hear have effective meaning. They are pleasant or unpleasant. Pleasantness is one of the core elements. Pleasantness and unpleasantness are among the core aspects of perceptual experience. And perceived events have effective meaning because of the sensitivities, the complex sensitivities that are often in psychology called needs. We have a large number of needs, of concerns. We are so made or developed in such a way that they are noticed, and that direction, that activity is directed towards events that one cares about. Yes? When we perceive elements that we like, which means is that the activity is geared to get more of that information in the same way as we briefly sketched it for the bacteria. Events are sought and appraised as pleasant when they promote one of those sensitivities. Yes? Generally, the very notion of pleasure means that you are inclined to get more of it or to increase duration or intensity of interaction. And disliked information is that we try to get to decrease the interaction with and undo the possibilities of not getting the elements that might satisfy the concerns and the needs. One of the interesting things is, of course, that every element and every perceived element, every perceived event can touch upon a large number of concerns and of sensitivities and interests. Take, for instance, in the complexity of life, take the situation of somebody you like or love is dying. Yes? One of the consequences of somebody who is ill or is dying is that it touches upon the concern of increasing and maintaining the interaction. But at the same time, when somebody is dying after a long illness, it is a liberation from the suffering that you had for that individual. That is, the emotional response to a complex event is a complexity of meaning because of the large number of different sensitivities that any event might impact upon. Interesting is, of course, that an animal of a particular species is a large number of interests. Yeah? For food, for sexual interaction, for knowing and moving about in a social environment, because the presence of other individuals of the same species is one of the desires that we have and one of the concerns that construct a particular individual species.
Nico, I think we have like 5 minutes.
I'm too long? Okay, then I make it very...
Just to give some time for questions. Yeah.
I'm talking about action. I was talking about self-initiated movement. I was talking of self-initiated movement directed by the affective value of the information, like contributing to one of the activation situations. But of course, one of the other things that the action system of the life systems engage is that they not only move, but that they also act. We learn the consequences of our actions, and we undertake actions that might yield those outcomes that do increase the activity of the individual. We learn expectations of everything that happens in the environment due to our previous interaction with them. And it is interesting, young mammals, humans as well as non-humans, eagerly and actively explore what happens as a result of their environments. And not only that, emotional events that happen to that happen to and that have affective value are not only events that happen not only inside actions to undertake them, but they might undertake the inclination to modify the relationship between the individual and the event in the environment. They can be practical or routine actions, but most often they are caused by events with affective value. Events that are felt as pleasant or unpleasant, or that predict that something pleasant or unpleasant may come. Most of the time in the encountering events of an individual or just events that occur, we may be ready to decrease, to modify or maintain our interaction with the environmental event. Yes. Most events that occur to us may give rise to affective value, to pleasure or displeasure, but even when we do so, we may not immediately act. You just may experience the inclination to modify the relationship with the particular event, yes? The number of different modes of interaction is a limited number, yes? One can describe the interaction between an individual and its environment as the outcome of an inclination to modify the relationship, just as for instance in this picture. You can see what the person is doing is seeking to ward off the influence of some forthcoming event. What we call expressive behavior is not so much the expression of feeling in order to others, but just to modify events so that their disagreeable implications are decreased and their pleasurable inclinations are increased. This leads to the central notion, as I say, of modes of action readiness. Much of our emotional inclinations are states of readiness to modify the relationship. When somebody is doing something nasty to her or threatening to her in this case, the action are such as to decrease that interaction. Yes? Expressive behavior is generally a mode of action to modify the relationship, as I can perhaps best illustrate with a few other photographs, like this little baby who is not only expressing some emotion, it may be said not to express any emotion at all, but what it is doing is increasing its visual interaction with the environment by opening the eyes so that peripheral information can come up more from it. Here is a similar kind of photograph, but slightly different, with a slightly more active setup to interact with the environment. Or here is an individual that does not interact with the environment. Evidently, he is interacting with thoughts that you cannot see, that are not present in the actual situation. So what we say, this is a man expressing the emotional state? No, it is engaging in an action state of action readiness, of engaging in, of interacting with information that is not at that particular moment interacting. Now what this notion of action readiness seeks to engage, to lay hands on, is that human beings, no, animals in general, all animals in general, have one of the major features of striving. Individuals, animals of any sort, humans included, vary in the engagement or non-engagement of interaction. One of the most, the clearest indication of the fact that the interaction with the environment is trying to follow the increase of pleasure and the decrease of displeasure is by engaging as much activity and as much force in the activity to achieve a particular outcome. And there is nothing specific for humans in all this. Once in southern France, I sat in the grass near a brook. A blue dragonfly alighted on a blade of grass, a female as it proved. Another dragonfly approached. The first one's wings started to tremble, and she bent the hind part of her body aside. He, the other dragonfly, mounted her. However, a gust of wind blew him off. He at once came back, and he tried again. And again he fell off, and again he came back. It was repeated until the interaction was evidently completed. They came to rest and he flew off. There also, in the whole orientation towards interaction with the environment, or absence of interaction with the environment, according to the concerns that were involved in the situation. There are situations, of course, that do not give rise to a state of action readiness. There exist circumstances that do not allow to form action readiness because no meaningful action can be conceived of. Examples are being faced with a tsunami, or with political persecution, or with other inescapable contingencies, such as when caught in a building on fire, which exits closing or closed. Or exhaustion is one of the situations that the whole state of action readiness and the efforts of action readiness to improve the situation are getting disorganized in situations that account for the situation of anxiety, as we know those in situations that cannot be resolved. I hope that the sketch that I gave to the different aspects of interaction between individual and environment, and the notion of action readiness and actions that seek to implement the states of action readiness, these are really the functions that are giving shape to what we call emotions. Emotions do emotions do include one kind of mental process, but they engage processes, basic processes that are functionally relevant. What I call the appraisal, getting the meaning of events on the basis of sensitivity or on the basis of previous experience, and the possibility of striving of organizing action in order to improve the individual-environment relationship. To give an answer to the first question, do emotions exist? Yes. What are emotions? Emotions are situations into one or more of the basic processes are engaged in dealing or not dealing with the environment. The word emotion does not refer to one particular basic structural capability, but of one or the more of
Thank you. Close.
Stop.
Yeah, please stop
So you
closing
can see
because
your
my
lips.
ears
Okay.
are very bad.
You wrote it in English?
Yeah.
But you can talk to him.
Okay.
Just try.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, if action readiness is mediated by a semantic system with meaningful experience, meaningful information from the environment, but in humans, this system is generative, is not finished. It's not finished. Does that mean that humans' emotion can be also infinite and also continuously created?
I think that human emotion is indeed infinite because one of the interesting things is when perceptions are meaningful, so they give it meaning, that means the meaning of impressions is due in part of actualization of previous experiences, plus all cognitive capacities of making inferences from the information that there is, and that process, of course, is in fact endless. You can always, every impression that one gets, you can elaborate it and elaborate it so that it gets richer and richer in information, yes? And the amazing thing is that the making of inferences of the immediate presence of a particular object goes with an extreme rapidity, yes? The association that you make in, well, any fleeting impression that you get can make you dream or can make your thoughts go away in an entirely different direction within seconds. In a very brief period, the processing of information connected to actually present information and its emotional impact is, well, not only going very fast, it can all be going on very fast with the absence of active direction into better understanding what happened. And one of the examples is, of course, that when there is no direction in your thought, like for instance in dreams, they can go through entire domains of information even without any effort to do it.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the talk. I have a question regarding the issue of circular causality. Circular causality. Circular
Oh,
causality.
circular, yeah.
Without the rest of it, there are too many things.
Circular causality.
Yeah.
Could one say, in a sense, that it's only an illusion, and it depends more on the fact that you are considering the system as a totality, and only when considering the system as a totality can you talk about circular causality? Because if not, there's no possibility. I mean, if I want, I just analytically can stay in one of the frames and there's only linear causality. There's one arrow of entropy, nothing more. But when you consider the system as a totality in terms that its identity is extended in time, only then can you talk about circular causality.
I think you're right.
So what implications has this? I mean, because this then it's a property, circular causality is a property of the living being, not of the previous form of organization.
I don't think I understand you. I think circular causality is only possible when the system is functioning properly. Yes, and when the autopoietic functioning of the whole system is interrupted or broken down at a particular moment, the functioning is decaying.
Yes, no, I don't think there's a problem. I mean, I don't think it's bad. I'm just sort of, it's more than a question, is maybe a comment in the sense of what does it mean in a way that circular causality only happens when you have a certain totality you can observe. I mean, is it a property of a system? Is it a property of the one that's observing the system?
I think it's a property of the system.
May I add something? Because I think in his talk he developed the implication is that we should focus on the organism movement. It's unfolding in time. There's a property of the system as a static whole. It's a property of its movement. That's where you have
but I don't agree
action
completely.
readiness.
It's the thing is that I don't completely agree with this. It's not only the property of the system's movement. It's the fact that the system's movement is always brought upon by itself. I mean, it's not just the fact that you're moving in time. Moving in time, you can understand it without circular causality. You can understand this with linear causality. The question is, in a way, it's a way of trying to go back to a more, I don't know if fundamental, but more complicated question is what makes the difference between self-organization and living? Because self-organization is everywhere. But is self-organization a case of circular causality? Is there a distinction between circular causality, I mean self-organization and the living? Is there a change in terms of the circular causality there? Because self-organization, you find it anywhere and you don't necessarily call it living. But you need it for something that has to be alive. So maybe circular causality is not a property of the living. I mean, to where do I extend this notion? That's my question.
I think circular causality is a necessary consequence of the organization of a living system, namely the fact that every sub-process in a living system is being triggered by the previous situation and the outcomes of the whole situation and the whole processing going on, that is going on anyway because the outcomes are found in the next round of processing. Yes? So I think the circular causality is a necessary consequence of the autopoietic structure, the organization, as depicted in the representation of Materana and Varela's model.
Yeah, it's a way, and in a way, I don't mean to say I don't agree with that. I'm just saying to how much can I extend the concept of circular causality away from the living. And I think one can bring it further down because self-organization, that was the point I was trying to make. Self-organization happens without the need to be called living. I mean, the clouds or vortices, there are cases of self-organization that you don't spontaneously call living, in which you could also recognize a certain circular causality. So what makes the distinction between a self-organized system with a circular causality structure and a living system? Where is the distinction? I'm not sure I see it.
I have no answer. I have to think about that, what you're saying, because the degree to which circular causality is limited to living systems, I'm not sure about. I do agree with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos por venir. Esperamos que participen en los próximos coloquios. Y darle gracias al profesor Nico por estar aquí. Thank you very much.